Hi, everybody. Good morning, and welcome to another class in our online course on data and macro development. We're delighted today to have Meredith Startz visiting us from Dartmouth, who's going to lecture on primary data collection. And we are going to, as before, have a 1 hour lecture, and then we're going to do 15 minutes of Q&A at the end. Meredith is one of the brightest stars in the constellation of young development economists and an expert on collecting her own data in interesting settings, in challenging settings. And so even though this class in some way is one of a kind, it's going to spill over into the things we've been talking about in the previous lectures. Only now we get to think about how one might design one's own survey rather than taking as given what existing collection has done. So just one logistical question or issue before we get started, which is if you're in the front row, keep your microphone off. If you have a question, absolutely type it. You can type it into the chat. And you could type it directly to me if you want, but you should probably just send it to everybody. And then Meredith would like to have questions during the talk. So some of those times I'll say, hey, good question. Do you want to unmute and ask the question? And then if you're not in the front row and you have a question, just type it into the Q&A and I'll do my best to answer it. Or I'll say, hey, great question. Do you want to ask Meredith? And then we can either ask her during the lecture or at the end in the Q&A. Okay, so Meredith, thanks for agreeing to give this lecture, and take it away. We'll go for an hour if that works for you, about an hour. It doesn't have to be exactly an hour. And whenever you're ready, you can share screen.
Great, thanks, David. Oops. There we go. Can you guys see that?
Yep.
Great. Yeah, so thanks everybody for being here, and thanks a lot to STEG for organizing this course. I think the focus on data is really fantastic, that in economics, we maybe don't spend enough time overall talking about our data and where it comes from. And so I think this course is a hugely valuable resource that people are going to keep coming back to. So my task today is to talk to you about primary data collection, focusing on how that does and can get used for macro development research. So first, what is primary data? I'm going to take primary data collection to mean basically anything that you collect yourself. So that's kind of in contrast to everything else that you don't collect yourself, right? Which obviously covers a huge range of topics and basically everything else in this course. So this lecture is going to be a bit the odd one out if you've been to previous lectures, in that we're not focusing on a particular topic or a particular data source. We're kind of focusing on a method instead. And so that's going to make the structure of this talk maybe a little bit different. And, I was sort of talking to David and Joe before we started here. You could easily take a course for an entire semester on even like some subcomponents of collecting your own data, like just on survey design. And so you should think of this as a really brief overview of a bunch of concepts, and then I'll try to provide some kind of terms and resources that you could use if you wanted to look into this further and get into more details. Two more kind of things to flag about what I'll focus on. So one is that in development economics research, collecting your own data is often associated with running RCTs for good reason, and I'll say a little bit about that. But I'm not going to talk about experiments or running RCTs at all. I think the data collection part is very similar whether you're running an experiment or not. So I'm just going to focus on the data collection side, and I'm not going to have time to say anything about the sort of logistics or theory of actually, managing a field experiment. Okay. The second thing is that I imagine, a lot of you may end up not collecting your own data. I would, encourage many people not to. I'm going to talk a little bit about sort of when it really makes sense and when it doesn't. But I do think that understanding some of the concepts and the things you want to pay attention to if you're designing your own data collection are actually really useful, even if you don't end up doing it. There'll be especially a lot of overlap with thinking about using other survey data, so not collected by you, but sort of the same kind of data generated by a researcher running a survey. You've heard a little bit about that, like the lecture on the LSMS data. But even beyond survey data, I think hopefully thinking about data collection and how it's designed can make you a more appreciative and maybe a more careful user of data from all sorts of sources, including those you've heard about in this class. So I hope there's a lot you can take away from this, even if you decide in the end not to run your own data collection. So as I said, I'm going to, by necessity, take a very different approach from some of the other lectures in this class. I can't tell you about commonly used data sources. And so instead, let me give you kind of an outline of what I'm going to try to do here. So first, I'll talk a little bit about when and why I think it makes sense to do primary data collection and when it doesn't make sense. I'm not going to tell you that it's always ideal to collect your own data. Second, I'm going to talk a little bit about the big picture strategy of how to use your own data collection to facilitate research and what features make it useful. And I'm going to try to do that through 2 examples of recent papers, one by me and one by some other great junior researchers working in macro development. And then at the end, I'm going to give you kind of a whirlwind tour of some of the technical and logistical considerations that come up when you're actually doing the data collection. And this is going to be a really brief overview of a whole bunch of concepts and things you want to think about. And then I'll try to leave you at the end with some sort of links to organizations and websites that you could use if you wanted to dig into them further. So please don't expect that that will be kind of a full course on everything you'd actually need to know. It's more just throwing some concepts at you so you know what to follow up on. Okay, so talking about when it makes sense to do your own data collection. So I would say the kind of most obvious time to collect your own data is when you want to do research on something that's not well covered by existing data sources. I think that tends to come in 2 types. One is when you're interested in studying a group of people or a section of the economy that is not covered well by existing data sources. So, there are a lot of those. One that particularly comes up in my research would be smaller informal firms, right? That kind of by nature get left out of a lot of data sources that are generated by governments that only cover registered firms or firms that pay taxes. They also end up not in a lot of kind of the early survey research on firms that focused on larger manufacturing firms, okay? But depending on your topic, there could be sort of other parts of the economy that you discover aren't well covered. The other type is you're interested in a topic that isn't covered by existing data. That could be almost anything. I'll try to give you some examples in a minute of what I mean by that. A second time that I think it makes sense to do your own data collection is when you want to evaluate the impact of an intervention or a policy, okay? And the reason you might need to do your own data collection is even if there are existing data sources related to that topic or intervention or policy, they're probably not going to happen to be in exactly the place with exactly the group of people at exactly the time that that intervention or new policy is being rolled out, right? And so if you want to see what's going on with a particular set of people or firms in a given place before and after a new policy gets rolled out, you're probably going to have to collect that data yourself. So that's another good reason, I think, to do it. A third, maybe I think the best reason with some caveats is that I think doing your own data collection can just help you learn a lot about how the world really works, right? That when you download a data set and you sort of stare at something that's generated by a data collection process that someone else managed and it's been cleaned and it's been reorganized, it's very hard to kind of see between the lines of the spreadsheet what's really going on, okay? And being out there collecting your own data can help you do that. But I want to flag right away that, often that doesn't require full formal structured data collection. Often that really requires you to just get out and do some kind of exploratory interviewing or qualitative research. And one thing I want to highlight right away is one of my favorite things about STEG and its philosophy, insofar as I understand it, I'll let Joe speak to that more if he has more comments later, is that they really support this sort of exploratory interviewing, that in fact the PhD student grants that STEG gives out, if you go to their website, that they're happy to have the grants support travel to field locations to do these kind of open-ended interviews and conversations with policymakers, even if you end up not sort of doing structured data collection yourself. I think that's really fantastic and can be incredibly valuable, especially for people working in macro development. So utilize that if that applies to you. Okay, so let me give you some examples of these kind of cases. So I'll come back to these in more detail, but for a population that's not well covered by existing data, I'm going to show you the example of the data in my job market paper, where the focus is on wholesale traders in Nigeria. And maybe surprisingly, wholesaling is very poorly covered by any standard firm data sources. There's a lot of focus on manufacturers, and then in existing survey data, there's sometimes a focus on tiny retail, like, vegetable sellers in markets. There's very little data covering wholesale traders. And so that was one reason that I collected my own data, is just that whole group of firms was not showing up in the data sources I could find. Two examples of collecting data because a topic isn't well covered. So again, in some of my work that I'll come back to, I was interested in the fact that these wholesalers seem to be traveling to their suppliers' locations when they source goods. And in existing trade data sets, there was just no information about that. Nobody was asking questions or collecting information on travel or travel costs. And so I couldn't use existing data for that. Another example I'll come back to is this Achieving Scale Collectively paper, which is looking at rental markets for production equipment in Uganda. And that, again, is a topic that even in really nice firm data sets focused on manufacturers in developing countries, there just wasn't a whole lot of information about rental of capital equipment. And so they have a bunch of really detailed data collection to focus on that topic that's not well covered. And then a third case that, because I'm not going to focus on RCTs, I won't spend too much time on, but, maybe David or somebody else can talk to you about it, is there are some increasingly great examples in macro development of using data collection to sort of follow up on a causal estimate of a parameter that comes from a randomized control trial. So one example that I really like is this experiment that subsidized seasonal migration for workers in Bangladesh. And there were existing data sets, I think even in Bangladesh, that looked at migration. Okay, so that wasn't the reason for doing the data collection. The reason for doing the data collection is that they were actually doing this intervention where they subsidized the migration to create exogenous variation in what was happening, and then they wanted to follow up with those particular individuals, okay? And from that, there's a series of papers that use that exogenous variation and specific data collection to answer some really cool macro development questions. So what are some pros of doing your own data collection in those kind of cases? I would say, the number one thing is that it just gives you huge freedom to study things that are different from what people are already studying, right? There's this sort of problem that by definition, if you're using existing data sets, you're kind of studying something that somebody has already thought it's worth collecting data about, right? And so when you collect your own data, you just kind of have opened up the possibility to think creatively about things that nobody already thinks is interesting and therefore is not studying. And that's obviously, maybe high return if you hit on something really cool. It's also very high risk to sort of go in with the idea that you're going to do something totally different from what other people are doing. And I'll come back to those risks in a second. But, I want to emphasize some of the sort of pros relative to using data that somebody else has collected is that one, in existing data, it's often, hard to find data or exogenous variation that's not already being used by other researchers, that there are some sort of well-loved data sets and policies that we've thumbed over very, very thoroughly and used again and again. And we sort of, it can sometimes, I think, feel hard, especially as a graduate student or a young researcher, to find something new there, right? And sometimes that's easier if you come up with an existing, but you know, a data set that wasn't necessarily generated for research purposes, and so may not have been used by so many researchers yet. So that's, you know, data sets that come from government sources or even private firms. But those have their downsides too, right? They measure things that the agency or firm that collect the data is interested in, which may not be the same things that we think are interesting as researchers. They're going to cover populations that are, again, of interest to that firm or government agency, and that are often selected in arbitrary ways that are not representative or not what you're interested in as a researcher. And they're also going to suffer from sort of any biases or weird relationships that the you know, people have with that government agency or that firm. Okay, so for those reasons, you may find your own data to be kind of freeing. The last thing I want to flag, which I think can be, you know, really important, although we don't talk about it, is that kind of depending on your personality and your work style, it can be really nice to collect your own data. I'm going to talk about it's a very different set of skills. You know, you're much more connected to the people and firms that I think a lot of people get into development economics research because they're interested in the problems faced by those people, or they're interested in making the world a better place. And it, you know, when you come in with that motivation, it can be very alienating to spend your whole life staring at sterile data sets. And I think doing field work and collecting your own data kind of gives you an opportunity to be really grounded in the reality faced by those people and understanding how they're actually making decisions. And it's also just a very different work style, right? You're more likely to be working with a team, talking to people every day. You can take sort of a more anthropological approach to understanding what people are doing. So I don't think we often talk about that, but I think that can actually be important for how you feel about your research. So, okay, what are the downsides? There are many downsides. So let me talk about some of the costs and risks on a high level. So I think the number one thing, especially if you're a PhD student, to think about is just the incredibly long time horizon that is almost always involved when you're collecting your own data. So one way that I find it helpful to think about is if you collect your own data, you know, your colleagues or your competitors or your co-authors or whatever, their work, where, you know, if they just download a data set, their work basically starts where your entire data collection project ends. And so you've just added, you know, potentially years to the lifetime of your project. And that can really matter for kind of our professional incentives and the timelines that we're on. A second issue is that you face all sorts of risks that are often outside of your control that can affect your ability to complete the research. So in the last few years, I've had projects derailed by a global pandemic, by civil conflict and war, by borders getting shut down, by the market that I was working in being bulldozed by the local government, right? There are just all sorts of things that can happen that you can't control. There are also just smaller things, you know, the logistics of your project, you know, hiring a bad person, finding that somebody on your team is submitting fraudulent data, discovering something costs more than you thought it was going to, right? And something that I also want to emphasize is there's also risk around the results you find that I think as a grad student, you often get good advice to try to fail fast, right? Come up with cool ideas, take a first pass look at the data, see if it looks like there's anything there. And if it's not seeming promising, drop the project and move on to something else. And I think that's great advice. And it's much harder to do when you're collecting your own data, okay? Maybe the most obvious one is that it can be really expensive. I think for a lot of people, this is a prohibitive barrier that you need to be able to raise money to actually go do the data collection. I don't want to underemphasize that. I don't think there's much to say about it. That's sort of an obvious challenge. I think the one thing to notice, though, is that it can also have sort of indirect consequences, right? That because you need to raise money to do the data collection, you may end up having a smaller sample size than you would, for instance, if you just download data that somebody very well funded has collected. And the final thing is that doing your own data collection really involves a pretty different set of skills than everything else that we do in this profession. I think graduate students already sometimes feel like we don't get trained for the nitty-gritty of some of the things we need to do as researchers. Like, we don't get trained as programmers. And let me tell you, that is all magnified tenfold if you think about all the things you don't get trained to do that are needed to collect your own data, right? That there are a lot of skills around how to design a good survey, around how to, manage teams and their logistics, often in challenging settings. And I don't want anybody to underestimate. That can be really cool. It can be fun. And if you're good at that, it can feel nice to use those skills professionally, but don't underestimate how different that is from everything else we need to do as academic economists. Okay, so last thing I want to say about this is that there are some things that I think sometimes get brought up, like in seminars, as that I think are wrong. I was thinking of saying something less polite about that, but they're not actually cons. Okay, so sometimes you'll get pushback around things like, well, admin data is sort of like objectively correct, whereas the data you've collected is small. That's a word that gets used especially by macro audiences, right? Or it's not representative, or it's self-reported, by which I think people mean that it's going to be subject to all sorts of reporting biases. Okay. Those are all potentially true, but it's true about all data, right? All data comes from somewhere. And sort of contrary to what I think a lot of economic seminar audiences believe, almost all data is self-reported, whatever that means, right? If you think about like tax data that come from governments, if you've ever had the misfortune to pay taxes in the US at least, that's entirely self-reported and subject to all sorts of recall biases and misreporting biases and other things, okay? And so, administrative data can have all these same problems. I think in many cases they're worse, right? If you think about who's in your data set, if you look at formal firm data, often below a certain size, firms aren't required to formally register, or below a certain transaction size, they're not required to do VAT reporting. You get all of the misreporting biases that come from people who have incentives to do things like evade taxes or avoid paying tariffs or import prohibited goods. Right? They're not going to tell the government honestly what they're doing. If you're working with private firm data, you get these weird sample selections related to sort of who's using the product or engaging with the firm, right? So like if you're looking at app data, for instance, you're only getting whoever in that country or that location uses smartphones. And often there can be some really subtle issues. So Matt Grant has this cool recent paper that's sort of saying even the kind of organization or classification systems in government data reflect the purposes of the government agency that generated that data. So the particular example is, in trade data, there are these product codes that as researchers, we often interpret as sort of some objective definition of a product. Okay, so, when a new code appears, it means that there's been innovation and new products are appearing. And what he shows is that actually these are for applying tariffs. And so for types of products that the government is really interested in applying taxes to, you get these very narrowly defined, a particular type of steel with a particular composition rolled to a certain thinness of a particular size, right? And for places that they don't want to tax, you get these huge broad categories with all sorts of product variation within them, like all fertilizers of all types, okay? And that if you try to use that as a researcher without thinking about where the data came from, you end up getting super biased estimates of things like trade elasticity. So that's just one example, but I think kind of the upshot here is that actually all of these are totally valid concerns and things you should absolutely think about if you're collecting your own data. It's just that you should absolutely apply the same standards to data that you just download as well. Okay, you should think about these concerns regardless of where your data comes from. Okay, so upshot is, overall, I would say do not collect your own data unless you're really clear on sort of why you're doing it and that you're taking on the costs and risks with open eyes, and sort of don't recreate the wheel unnecessarily. There are a lot of cool data sources out there, all right? A very sort of brief aside is I think, primary data collection is obviously much more common in micro than macro development. And I think, traditionally that's been because macro has been focused on aggregates, things at the country level, and a little less concerned about causal identification than micro. And I think that in recent years, there's been some really productive convergence between micro and macro development, right? Where macro is becoming more concerned with micro foundations in its models and with causal identification. Micro development is becoming more aware that a lot of things are developed, determined in equilibrium, and that you want to think about equilibrium and spillovers. And from that convergence, I think we're getting a really nice combination in a lot of fields between kind of macro modeling and micro development data and methods. So I think there is a lot of exciting stuff to do here. I don't want to scare you off of it. I just think you need to be clear-eyed about kind of what you're doing and why. Okay, let me kind of move into the next section of my talk, which is talking a little bit about the strategy of collecting your own data through the lens of a couple of examples. So I want to start off by saying, what purpose are you putting this data to after you collect it? And I'm going to group this into 3 bins. So one is maybe you want to describe a new phenomenon or lay out some new facts that you think we actually don't know anything about even descriptively. Second, you might want to use your data to identify a particular causal mechanism or estimate a parameter. And third, you might want to use it to quantify a full model. Okay, and the examples I'm going to talk through are sort of encouraging you to, right from the beginning of your project, think about designing the data collection in a way that will enable whichever of these purposes you're pursuing. So the first example I'm going to talk through, because it's one that I know very well and we can get into the details of, is my job market paper, which used primary data that I collected from wholesale and retail traders in Lagos in Nigeria. And it comes from panel data that I'll sometimes refer to here as the Lagos Trader Survey. So this paper tries to do all 3 of those things. So documenting some new facts. And in particular, the kind of new fact that I was putting out there is that traveling to buy from suppliers in person when sourcing goods is a really common strategy used by wholesale and retail traders in Nigeria. That, of course, is not a new fact that people actually doing that. It was only a new fact to economists. The second was to try to identify what the sort of causal mechanism that was driving that was. And so I argue that this is basically a costly strategy that firms use to overcome information problems related to searching for new products and enforcing agreements with suppliers. And then third, I use that data to try to quantify a model where firms are making an endogenous choice about whether to pay that cost to travel, to do a spot transaction and search for new products, or to order remotely and deal with those information problems, and trying to use that to kind of back out the implied size of those information frictions as a trade cost. Okay. I'm going to focus for time reasons really just on how I can use the data for the first one of these for documenting new facts. So this data, I'm going to come back to some of these points in more detail. In the Lagos Trader Survey is a survey with about 1,200 traders in Lagos. It's a sample of shops from a census I conducted. I'll come back to that later. And the structure of the data ends up being a panel of shipments and transactions conducted over a 2-year period by these traders. And I'll come back to that too. And broadly, you should think of these traders as people who are buying and reselling manufactured consumer goods. So clothing, shoes, cell phones, cosmetics, furniture, things like that. And it gets imported from a bunch of different countries, a lot of it from China, okay? And these are basically small, mostly importers who are buying and reselling goods. They're pretty big in the realm of, like small retail, informal businesses in a developing country. So this is not the ladies selling vegetables at the market, but they're also not huge formal multinational firms, right? These are people with kind of one shop and one worker. So these are guys who are really not covered well by any existing data source that we have. So the kind of first part of this data collection was designed to dig into this fact that I became aware of. I'll talk more about that in a second, that a lot of these traders travel to the source location where their supplier is located when purchasing. And so the data enables me to kind of lay out facts like what I'm showing you. So one thing is that it lets me show patterns about who travels with respect to the source country and the type of product that people are selling, right? So here I can show you what is the cost that a trader reports for a particular trip and what country were they buying from. And kind of the first thing we see, which, I didn't know, but is maybe kind of intuitive in retrospect, is that when they're buying from nearby countries in West Africa that are really cheap to get to, they almost always travel when they buy. And then for more expensive, difficult to get to places like China and the US, where plane tickets are expensive and visas are really difficult to get, they only travel about a third of the time. And similarly, we can see patterns across products, okay, where for products like hardware that kind of aren't changing that often, right? There aren't like fashions or new technologies coming out, people rarely travel. And for stuff like apparel, where there's new fashions coming out all the time, they travel a lot, okay? This sort of, pattern is enabled by understanding the relationship between travel in the data and sectors and source countries. But I'll show you in a second, the way the data is structured also lets us say things at the specific transaction level. And that lets me lay out new facts like this one, right? Which is what I'm showing you here is for a typical import purchase from China. If it's ordered remotely, so the trader didn't travel, what's the value of goods purchased and how much did they pay in total in transportation costs and tariffs? And then for a typical import shipment, if they did travel to the source location, again, what's the cost of goods? What's the cost of transportation and tariffs? And then what's the cost they actually sell, right? And there's kind of a lot packed into this graph, but you can start to see some patterns that motivate how to think about a model, right? So first, ordered shipments are smaller than travel shipments. And although you can't see it here, they're also more frequent. So when traders are ordering, they're buying more frequently in small batches. When they're traveling, they're buying less frequently in large batches. Second, you can see that transportation costs and tariffs are kind of about the same as a proportion of the cost of goods purchased. So this isn't like about smuggling or enabling some totally different transportation method. And third, we can see that travel costs are huge. So this red bar is like the kind of trade costs that trade economists almost always focus on, right? The costs of transportation and regulatory costs. And what we can see is that when traders travel, the travel cost itself is on the same order of magnitude, even maybe a little bigger than all these traditional trade costs and barriers that we pay attention to. So when I'm talking about laying out new facts, you want to think about how can I design the data collection to let me describe this new phenomenon that maybe economists aren't thinking about enough. So how do we do that? I'm showing you a page from the first questionnaire, the first version of the questionnaire that I ran. Okay, and this is a bunch of questions that I was asking in this survey about travel that enabled me to generate those kind of graphs that I was just showing you. And so what this questionnaire is doing is it's asking a trader about a specific trip. So I don't know if you guys can see the text here well, but the first question here is, where did you go on a specific trip during this time period? And then it asks them when they actually went on that trip. So this is not about travel in general. Did you ever travel? It's about a very specific trip they took. And then it goes through and there are a whole bunch of questions about detailed components of costs. So asking separately about visas, how much the visa cost, how long it took them to get it, how much they spent for a plane ticket, how much they spent on shipping, how much they spent on tariffs and clearing the port, whether they actually carried any products back with them in their luggage, right? I won't read all these questions to you, but I think the thing I want to emphasize is twofold. One, it's asking about a specific trip, not kind of overall, an average, do you ever travel? How do you think about travel? And two, it's trying to get really concrete and detailed about specific components of costs and activities. Okay, so I think I just sort of said some of this, right? But so what about the way the data collection is structured is enabling this? So one, there's just a ton of descriptive detail. I just said that. And there's a combination of quantitative and qualitative questions. So I asked both things like, how much did you pay for your plane ticket? But also things like, what activities were you doing on the trip? And why did you decide to travel rather than just ordering goods remotely? Okay. The second thing about this data collection is that it generated a particularly useful data structure. Okay, so this is a single survey round, but the way the survey is organized lets me create basically a retrospective panel of import transactions. Okay, so because I asked about a bunch of specific trips and orders in the past, I can actually see that for a particular individual, maybe they had actually 4 import purchases in a particular year. And I can see for each one, what was the specific product they bought, which particular supplier did they buy it from, what was the date, and did they travel or order? And you know, a bunch of other things about the price of the product and so on. But the important thing is that even though we're sort of taking a single survey round, we end up with this panel data type structure, okay? And I'm not going to get into the details, but that sort of enables a different type of identification strategy with very detailed fixed effects. So from this one survey round, I can run regressions comparing traveling and ordering that have fixed effects up to kind of the specific source country, buyer, seller, product code level, and compare what happens when you travel or you don't at that level of detail. Okay, so, you know, the last thing I want to say about kind of documenting a new phenomenon is that I think sometimes when I talk to people about this, it's like, well, if it's something new, like how do you even, how would you think to go collect data about something that we don't already know about? This is totally idiosyncratic, but let me just tell you a little bit about what the process was for me. So I think the first is that there has to be some kind of luck that like puts you on to this new phenomenon. And often I think that just has to do with talking to people who know things different from what you know and listening. So for me, it just happened to be sitting next to a political scientist at a dinner at a conference, and she was doing research on market associations in West Africa. And she just happened to be telling me stories about it and about how it was hard for her to interview people sometimes because they would disappear for weeks at a time and nobody knew where they went. And then they would come back and it turned out that they were in China. Okay. And I was like, wow, traders like spend weeks in China. That's weird. I wonder what's going on there. Right. Okay. And then the next step is kind of exploratory field work. So I was like, that's weird. Something interesting going on there. I don't really know what it is yet. And so then I went to Lagos and I spent a lot of time just chatting with traders. Like, what are they doing? Are they traveling? How do they think about it? Why are they doing that? What other strategies are they using in their business? What's their history with travel? And you hear a lot of crazy, interesting stories that spark tons of ideas. I think, you know, like I have more ideas from that month of open-ended interviews than I will ever be able to do research on in my entire career. Plus, it's a lot of fun. Okay. The next step is actually starting to think about data collection. So piloting, and by piloting, I mean, you know, drafting a kind of more structured questionnaire and testing it out, right? Actually trying it, seeing what sort of answers you get, what types of questions are working, which ones aren't working, you know, does the data you're getting seem to kind of validate the hypothesis that you're going after, okay? And then the final step is, you know, the subject supposedly of this lecture, which is actually doing the primary data collection, right? And running a full survey. And I just want to emphasize that there's kind of all of these steps leading up to that I would encourage anybody to do before you try to do something like raising money or committing yourself to a full survey round. Okay. So let me talk through a second example, which is this paper I love by a bunch of junior people called Achieving Scale Collectively. And it uses primary data they collected on manufacturing firms in some particular sectors in Uganda. Okay, and this is a paper that also, I think, tries to do all 3 of the things that I laid out. So they're documenting some new facts, which is around these incredibly active rental markets for particular pieces of equipment by small manufacturing firms working in geographic clusters in Uganda. Okay, we kind of didn't know how much of that was happening, and they showed that there's a lot of it happening. Then they identify mechanisms. So they're arguing that what's important about this is that, you know, we sometimes think of indivisibilities in capital equipment, that a small firm can't buy a big piece of equipment because of their scale. And what they're saying is that these rental markets enable small firms to actually gain a lot of the productivity advantages of mechanization, even if they don't have the scale that you would think that they would need to overcome the indivisibility of that equipment. And then they're going to quantify that model and sort of tell us, you know, what it means for overall productivity and misallocation. Okay, I'm going to focus mostly on how they deal with this second one, how the data structure enables them to identify a mechanism and estimate a parameter. So they have this incredibly cool detailed data. So on the left, what I'm showing you here is their figure relating how co-located firms are geographically with firm size in a particular sector. And so they're showing you that for some firms, they're really small and in these clusters where they're really close together, and in other sectors, they're bigger and more spread out. And then they're going to look at firms within some of these sectors that have some geographic clustering. And they're going to look on the right here at particular pieces of production equipment. And they're going to show you that there's a lot of variation in these firm clusters in the cost of a piece of equipment and how much firms tend to rent out that piece of equipment when they need it versus actually purchasing it and owning it within the firm. Okay. And, again, I don't know if you can see kind of how much detailed data is packed into this figure, right? But they know about all these very specific pieces of equipment at the firm level. And that comes out of this amazing detailed questionnaire. So I'm just showing you a tiny little snapshot. This questionnaire is actually 187 pages long to give you a sense of the level of detail that goes into this. And there are a few things that I want to highlight about the way these kind of questions are asked that enables this analysis. So, one is, again, they're asking about something very specific. So what this is the kind of programming for a particular type of machinery. And so they're asking, how many of this particular piece of machinery do you use in the production of a particular output product? Okay. And then they start asking these more and more detailed questions. How many hours are you operating this particular piece of equipment each product, right? How many days per week are you running it? And then they start asking these questions about, how much of that is actually owned by your firm versus rented. All right. And this is the kind of detail that really enables you to do what I'm about to show you, which is they're estimating this model. And it's a model about firms' choice to rent versus own a particular piece of equipment. And they have a challenge. Obviously, there's a ton that goes into this model that I'm not going to have time to talk about. But one challenge that I think is interesting and illustrative is that they think there are likely to be transaction costs that are involved in renting that are really hard to observe or measure directly. And so they have a parameter in their model that's about the size of those transaction costs that they want to estimate. Okay. And their model provides an estimating equation, says that basically the ratio of expenditure on capital inputs versus labor inputs should be related to the fraction of capital equipment that is rented rather than owned. And this parameter beta 1 should tell you about that transaction cost, that when transaction costs are higher, you would expect to see basically a lower ratio of capital to labor use. Okay. And they have an identification problem, which is that you might expect unobserved firm characteristics that are in the error term in this equation to be correlated with both the capital labor ratio and the choice to rent. And so they're worried that they're going to get a biased coefficient here that's going to give them an incorrectly estimated parameter about the size of this transaction cost. And what I've been building up to here is that this incredible structure of their data gives them this really nice way of dealing with that problem, which is that because they've collected information about specific machines used at specific steps in the production process for a specific product within a firm, they have basically variation within a single firm about how much is rented versus owned in a particular production step. Okay, and what that means is that they can include firm fixed effects in this estimating equation, which is going to deal with this concern about unobserved firm characteristics. Okay, and they're going to argue that that lets us get an unbiased estimate of this parameter beta 1 that's going to now be identified off of this within firm variation in the extent to which you rent versus own machines. And that's what this subscript S is doing here, is that it's saying it's specific to a production stage for a particular product within a firm. So the kind of upshot of all this is that because they thought about how to design the survey to collect this within firm variation, they now have an identification strategy that lets them estimate this particular parameter that goes into the model, right? And if you had just sort of asked overall questions about like, does your firm rent equipment? There's no way you would be able to do this kind of estimation. Okay, So, David, are there any pressing questions? If not, I'll kind of move on to the kind of practical advice section.
So there are good questions. They're not kind of natural fits for exactly what you're talking about now. So my suggestion is to keep going, and we can collect them.
Great. Okay. Then let me sort of move on to the last section of what I want to talk about, which is a bit of a whirlwind tour of technical and practical considerations that are going to come up if you decide to collect your own data. Okay. So I'm going to talk again, basically going to throw out some terms and concepts at you and expect that then hopefully that means you're just aware that those are things you need to think about, and you can follow up with other resources to learn more details. So I'm going to talk a little bit about sampling, survey design, field management, and data quality. So let's start with sampling. So 3 concepts that I think it is useful to be careful with, even when you're not collecting your own data, are thinking first, what is the population of interest? So the population is basically if you're making a statement like, my data is representative of blank, the population is blank. You know, what is the group that you intend your data to describe? Okay, so for my paper, I started out thinking like, well, maybe I want it to be representative of wholesale and retail firms in Nigeria. I quickly realized that that was way too vague and impractical. There's no way I could collect data that would represent that population effectively. And so you end up being kind of more concrete and narrow about what population are you actually representing. And so for me, in the end, it's something more like wholesale and retail firms that are operating from permanent physical premises in particular commercial neighborhoods in the city of Lagos in Nigeria. Okay. Even then, the next step is a practical problem, which is I need some way to actually find individuals in that population to collect data from. And that step usually involves defining what we call a sample frame, which is basically an actual list or practical way of selecting individuals from that population. So in my case, I'll show you in a second, this basically takes the form of a list of how many shops are selling each type of product on each floor of each building in these neighborhoods. Okay, but it's a literal listing of shops in those places is the sample frame, right? Which is going to be different from the population. It's sort of the practical implementation of the population you're trying to represent. And then the last thing is the actual sample, which is that the individuals or the units that you actually select from the sample frame to try to collect data from. So in the case of my work in Lagos, building the sample frame was really the hard part. And so I'm going to give you an example of what that can look like. So in practice, it started with basically a list of markets and plazas, buildings and commercial areas that the city waste collection agency had. Right? Why do they have it? Well, they have to pick up the trash from all those places. Okay, so we started with that, right? But that's just like a list of markets. And so then enumerators actually went into all these areas. So like this is a commercial area in Lagos Island where there are shops both in these kind of low covered markets and in these mid-rise buildings. And they actually drew maps of these buildings like this one on the right, and then went into each building and counted how many shops were selling each type of product on each floor in each building in each of these markets or neighborhoods. Okay, and the sample frame is basically this list of tens of thousands of shops by their location and the type of product they were selling. So, that's kind of one strategy, but some practical things you want to think about are sort of first, how can you actually build a sample frame in a way that lets you represent the population you're interested in and actually track down sampled units in practice? So some things people commonly do are get rosters or registration lists from like a government agency. Sometimes if you're running an RCT, you're working with a partner organization that already has a set of users or clients that they want to work with, right? That's a great situation. Or often you end up actually going in and doing a kind of listing or a census, sometimes starting from a local informant or a local registration list, like the example I showed you. Once you've done that, some things you want to think about is how you want to actually take your sample. So what I did was a simple random sample, but you may want to think about stratifying your sample or overweighting certain groups. So for instance, if you were interested in large firms and you know there aren't that many large firms in the economy, you might decide to oversample large firms. And then when you actually do analysis, you end up needing to reweight those observations basically to argue that it's representative of the population you're studying. You might also want to think about taking clustered samples. For instance, if you want to be sure that you have a bunch of observations village or a given market, you might cluster your sampling at the village or the market level. A third thing you want to think about is the sample size you're going to be able to collect and what statistical power that implies. So, what actually limits sample size in practice, all sorts of things, your budget for data collection, how much time you have. If you're running an RCT, often your partner organization's logistics or budget are the limit. They can only actually afford to work with so many people. The downside of that is that a smaller sample size means you end up having less statistical power. And so it's often a good idea to run what we call power calculations ahead of time, which is sort of basically plugging in some assumptions about your outcome variables and your sample size to say how much power you're going to end up with. And I'm not going to be able to go through that, but there's some great resources and tools online for doing that. Okay, so let me then talk a little bit about survey design. And we could do a whole course on this. So again, this is just kind of like a tour of some things you might want to keep in mind. So one thing to think about before you even write down a questionnaire is to think about who's actually going to be the respondent. So if you're doing an interview, who's answering your questions? And the reason I'm flagging this is that I think sometimes people expect that that's going to be obvious once they've decided, oh, I'm sampling firms or I'm sampling households. It is not obvious. Who are you actually talking to within the firm or within the household? And that can matter a lot. Right. So, if I go to the firm and the person I meet is like the apprentice, they can't necessarily answer questions about the sourcing strategy. On the flip side, if I go to a firm and I meet the owner, they may be totally removed from like day-to-day sales strategies and activities. Right. Or within the household, you need to think about, are you talking to men or women? Are you talking to the head of the household? Are you talking to kids? And obviously they all have their own information and issues that are sensitive for them. And so this can actually matter a huge amount, even once you've done what you think is your sampling. A second thing to think about is how long your survey can really be in practice before people start to tell you to go away or refusing to answer your questions. That again is less obvious than you might think because it varies hugely from setting to setting. So when I was a graduate student, my advisors did a lot of data collection in rural settings, talking to farmers. And they could do these enormous 300-page long questionnaires. You're just chilling with the farmers. It's like off season. They're happy to talk to you for a few hours. You like get a beer together. Like it's great. And then my first project, I went to Uganda and I was talking to small firms. And after an hour and a half, they were like, they're trying to be polite, but they're like, come on, lady, like I have customers to attend to. Like can you move it along, please? And then I went to Lagos. And after about 20 minutes, these traders are like looking at their watches and they're not so polite. And they're like, come on now, lady, like I'm running a business here. What are you doing to me? And they start telling you to go away, right? And so that is in practice one of the constraints that I think people don't think about when they're designing a questionnaire, but it really matters. Another thing to think about is the details of kind of what format the data collection is actually going to take. So, it used to be a big deal to think about, are you going to do this like with a tablet or on paper? It's almost always computer assisted interviewing now, but then you want to think about like what program or software you're going to use to code up the survey and do the data collection. Are you going to conduct the interview on the phone, in person, online? Right, that those sort of have different trade-offs in terms of who you end up reaching and how well you communicate with respondents. Are you going to go once if you're going in person, or are you going to make multiple visits? And if you go in person, how much of the data you're collecting is from an interview where the respondent is answering questions, and how much of it is from like direct observation being done by the enumerator? So there are often really cool things you can do with just asking the enumerator to make observations. Without actually asking questions if you're doing an in-person visit. So once you come to actually designing your questionnaire, I think, the number one thing you want to do is think ahead about how does this questionnaire create the structure of the data that I'm going to end up analyzing, right? Am I going to have a panel of transactions? Am I going to have a single cross-section? And how are the questions that I'm writing down going to map to the variables that I actually use in analysis? So, the first thing I often tell students to do is tell me what your hypothesis is. Tell me what regression you're going to run or what model you're going to write down to test that hypothesis. Okay, and then tell me what's the outcome variable in that regression and which question in your survey is actually going to generate that outcome variable and what units is it measured in and where is the variation coming from and what's your sample size going to be. And I think it's useful to be really, really, really concrete about the connection between questions, data, and the analysis you're going to do. In practice, I think the number one advice about writing survey questions is this is the time in your life to be more pedantic than you have ever been before. Okay, so you need to write questions in a way that are way more clear and specific than you'll manage to do at a first pass, while at the same time being something that the respondents in your setting can actually understand and relate to. So this is a question that I pulled from the Achieving Scale Collectively paper. And, I'll let you read this at your leisure, but I want to highlight a couple of things. So, what they really want is some data on like, what's the life cycle of a piece of equipment? Like how long does it last? And in order to actually get that information, they have to take. So first, think about the specific type of machinery. Think about the one that's in the best condition if you have more than one. Okay. Then how long do you expect that to last before you need it to be replaced? That specific piece of equipment that's of a specific type that's in the best condition if you have more than one of them. And then they have this additional note to enumerators saying like, well, what does need to be replaced mean? Right? And they say, okay, what we mean by that is that it's actually like not working anymore. It totally doesn't work. Right. And I assume this is because they went to the field and they tested this question. I should double check this with them. Right. And they had people coming back and saying, well, what do you mean? Like I replaced it every 5 years, but like if I really wanted to push it, I could use it for 12 years. Right. And as soon as you start actually asking questions, you realize that like the nitty gritty gets really gritty really fast. Okay. And you have to think about that in the way you word questions. There are some important principles about how response options are framed, especially for categorical questions. So a good concept to be aware of is the idea that response options should be collectively exhaustive and mutually exclusive. That means that when enumerators hear a response and they go to code it and say like, which option does this correspond to? One, any response should fit into some category. Okay, there shouldn't be something where you're like, well, there's no code for that. And then mutually exclusive means there should never be a response that fits into more than one category, unless you design a select all that apply option, right? But if you want them to pick one code, it needs to be clear that it fits into one and only one code. And it's actually pretty hard to design questions that way, but really important. A kind of idiosyncratic tip, I'll come back to this, is don't use categorical variables when you don't need to. I think there's this temptation when designing surveys to like give people categories rather than just asking them for a number. And unless there's a reason not to, don't do that, because when you actually look at the data you get out, it's really hard to run regressions on categorical data. So just don't. And then of course you need to be very clear about units and reference periods. Don't ask people a question that they could answer in terms of days or months without specifying whether the answer is recorded in days or months, right? One kind of thing that's cool about the fact that we all do computer-assisted interviewing now is that there are all sorts of things you can do on the back end to make your enumerators and respondents' lives easier, right? You can sort of program in the relevance of different questions so you don't ask people questions that don't apply to them based on something they said earlier. You can randomize things so that you're only actually asking anybody a subset of questions to keep the questionnaire shorter or to kind of test out methodological issues in the survey. I can't go into everything cool that you can do with that, but I would say, use it to your advantage. I'm going to sort of skip some of this, I think, for time reasons, but kind of the third big category of stuff I want you to think about is field management, which just comes with its own set of sort of skills and problems. You need to think about who's actually going to do the data collection. Probably it's not just you as an individual, so you're going to work with a survey firm or some kind of nonprofit or research institute. They all have different strengths and weaknesses, but one to be aware of is that a lot of survey firms in developing countries they're not in business to work with academic researchers. They're in business to work with Coca-Cola, right, or Nestle, and they're used to doing market research, and that comes with very different strategies and quality standards than we have. And so in particular, if you're working with a survey firm, that's something to be aware of and be a fussy client and impose your own standards, okay? There's a whole bunch of stuff around kind of ethics and data protection. You can't just go do a survey, at least in the US, you need approval from what's called an institutional review board, which is usually based at your university. Depending on where you're working, there may also be sort of in context or in country procedures you need to go through. I will say briefly that I think the mapping between what IRBs are concerned about and the ethical concerns that we may have as development economists don't always match up well. And so for your purposes, I think the thing you really want to think about is informed consent. And thinking about that carefully may involve things beyond what the IRB actually requires you to do, but you kind of want to make sure that the people you're interviewing actually understand what they're being asked and what they're agreeing to and what's going to happen to their private information. And figuring out how to do that is going to vary a lot from context to context. Another thing I just want to briefly flag is that increasingly journals are expecting you to have registered your data or your pre-analysis plan before you collect it, especially if you're running an experiment, but increasingly even if you're not. And so that's another thing to think about before you even go to the field. Okay, in my last couple of minutes, let's talk a little bit about data quality. So number one advice, be there in person for your data collection as much as possible, at the very least for the piloting and enumerator training stages. Don't try to do this remotely. You'll have no idea what's actually happening on the ground, and you'll be unpleasantly surprised when you see your data. Two, I suggest that you roll out data collection efforts in stages and as slowly as you can afford to do given your budget and your personal timeline, right? So I kind of showed you that for me, I tend to start with these exploratory open-ended interviews. Then we do some more structured piloting. Then often at the beginning of a survey round, I actually do what I call a soft launch, which is I go in with what I think is going to be the exact questionnaire and the exact tracking protocol and all my data quality stuff set up. And we do data collection for a few days. And then we pause. And I talk to the enumerator team about the problems they had. I take a look at the data that came back. And then often we make further revisions before we actually do the full survey launch, okay? And so I think that the kind of general advice here is to just go slowly whenever possible and basically look at your data and talk to your team at every stage and kind of iterate and revise as you need to. And one thing to flag is that you will absolutely get pushback on that from everyone. Enumerators don't like going slowly. Survey firms don't like going slowly. Your advisor probably doesn't like you going slowly. It's absolutely worth it to ensure that the data ends up being what you need. The worst thing in the world is to have the survey firm like rush out and do 50% of the sample you can afford in the first week. And then you realize that like respondents weren't actually understanding the key question the way you thought they were, and half of your data is totally useless. Okay, and it's really worth avoiding that. Okay, I'm almost done here. My main advice is to look at your data really carefully, just visually, look through it, see if it's making any sense, see if you understand what's going on at every stage before you get in too deep, okay? Then there are a bunch of specific kind of protocols and practices that people tend to use to ensure data quality during the data collection process. So audits are actually sending an enumerator back to the same person or firm for a second time to ask a subset of the questions and see if they get the same responses. That's useful for catching fraud, but it's also useful for just seeing like, do your enumerators need retraining or do you need to reword questions? High frequency checks are things that you would run on your data to sort of look for crazy values or things that are internally inconsistent. You also often can kind of sit in on interviews to see what's going on, or build checks into the questionnaire so that if, enumerators enter really crazy values, it pops up a message saying, hey, did you really mean that? Or did you just like type in an extra 0 by accident? Okay. So let me wrap up. I'm a couple minutes over. What is kind of the upshot of all this? So I think you want to be really clear about why you're doing primary data collection and what you want to get out of it. If what you want to get out of it is just kind of learning more about how the world works, go be some open-ended interviews and don't feel like you're necessarily committed to actually doing full data collection. Okay, if you do decide to do the full data collection, have sketched out your hypothesis and your model ahead of time so that you know how your data structure is going to map to that. Think about where the kind of variation in your data and your identification is going to come from, and think about the structure of the data that's coming out of your questionnaire and how you can use that in the analysis. My last few sort of practical tips are, which David and Joe may disagree with me on, and I hope if they have other thoughts on this, but I think it's often good to go really deep on a topic rather than wide. So you saw that in kind of both of the paper examples I showed you, where they just really dig into the details heavily on one new topic. 2 is to kind of be creative about how you get people to answer questions. 2 is to ask quantitative questions, not categorical ones, whenever you can. I can't tell you how many questionnaires I see that just ask questions about great subjects in a way where it's nearly impossible to use the data that comes out for analysis because it's just in these like categories that you can't use in regressions. I would say if you're going to go do your own data collection, ask different questions than other people can. I think Joe may have a different perspective on this, which is, there's also some value in comparability of surveys across settings. So if you're asking about questions on a topic, it can be nice to word it the same way that other people have. But I also kind of think that like, if you're going to bother to go out and do your own data collection, you should kind of be learning about something new that we couldn't have gotten from looking at an existing data set. And the last thing is I would say, don't be so set in your hypothesis or your priors about what's going on that you can't change course and find something really new and fascinating by working in the field, which I think is kind of one of the most valuable things about doing that. All right. There's some links and resources at the end, but I know I'm a little over, so I'm gonna stop there. Thanks, everybody.
Okay, thank you, Meredith. That was a great intro to the plus and cons of doing your own survey, and then a practical guide to doing it. We have a bunch of questions. I kind of would like to go roughly in the order of the slides on kind of how you did it. Earlier on, you were talking about the various risks that you face. Sounds like you got some bad shocks. If I'm not mistaken, that was Victor wanted to ask something related to that. Victor, are you a panelist, and can you unmute?
Sure. Thank you so much for the presentation. Very, very interesting. I have a question regarding the risks that you were discussing at the beginning. For example, this fact that it can be that you go collect the data and it turns out that what you were thinking that was going to happen, it's not happening. So do you have any recommendations on what can you do at the planning stage so that you mitigate those risks? For example, thinking about different ideas at the same time and try to bring all of those ideas to the field directly, or related ideas, I don't know.
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think I have 2 answers. So one is I would re-emphasize the value of exploratory interviewing and piloting. So that can help you to fail fast. If you go do a little pilot survey, often you can see from that it's just what you thought was happening is not what's happening. And then you're not, you haven't committed your full budget or your full time, and you can kind of change course. The second thing is, I think sort of what you were saying, which is that you can often build multiple options into one data collection effort, right? You can, if you have 3 different hypotheses about what is going on, you can ask questions that enable you to test those against each other, right? Or, actually, both of the examples of papers I just showed you have follow-on papers that I think came from things that surprised us during the data collection. So for mine, I have a whole second paper about the fact that it turned out that these Lagos traders were often buying from upstream wholesalers not manufacturers. And that's not something that I was looking for when I went into the data collection. But when you kind of ask about those sort of details, sometimes you end up learning something that leads to a whole different paper, even if it wasn't what you were planning.
There were some questions about, let's say, call it sampling frame and bias. So I think there was 2 or 3 questions about that. Pamela, are you a panelist, and can you unmute? Yes, you are. There you are. Okay.
Yes, thank you so much, Prof. Thank you, Prof. Meredith, for the wonderful presentation. So my question is on how to get a sample for a particular product. Because for me, like previously, let's say, for example, in my master's and other studies that I've carried out, I was targeting, for example, smallholder farmers who are growing maize, cotton, and a particular crop, and it was easy for me to get the sampling frame from the extension officers and so forth. But for now, I am interested in consumers of a particular product, and in my case, it is consumers for dairy products. How can I go about that?
Yeah, so I'm not sure that I have a very specific suggestion for your particular product, and I'm not sure where you're working. I would say one strategy can be to work from points of sale. So, you know, it's a bit of a challenge if you don't necessarily know, for instance, where people buy their dairy products. But if you can figure that out, then you can consider actually sampling consumers as they arrive at a point of sale and think about things that way. Sometimes you can work from a household survey. I mean, if you think basically everybody consumes some dairy, sometimes you can work from a sample frame built for household surveys and just focus your questions on the particular product you're interested in. Now, that doesn't work if it's kind of a rare thing, right? Because then you would sample 100 households and you would find that only 5 of them actually consume the product you're interested in. But for something that almost everybody's consuming, like dairy, that might work.
That's fine. Thank you so much for the response.
Isaac?
Hello, it's Joachim.
Hang on, Joachim. Could you wait a few minutes?
Okay.
Isaac, could you ask the question, please?
Yes, thank you very much for the presentation. I have a question on computer-assisted web interviews. I know he didn't speak about that, but it's also on the line of primary data collection. So I have a question on self-selection bias. How do you mitigate that? And the second one too is also related to this one. How do you mitigate the issue of sending the questionnaire to the entire population, but because of self-selection, not everyone participated in the survey? How do you, correct that after the survey? Correct that so that you have a representative sample. Thank you.
Yeah. So I just want to make sure I understand. So by self-selection bias, you mean the second thing you said, where you may have a representative sample, but then not everyone is willing to respond to your survey. And so you end up with a selected sample for your actual data. Is that right?
Yes, exactly.
Yeah. So that's a really hard problem, and it's harder in some contexts than others. So I think my first pass is to try to make it as easy and appealing for people to respond as possible. So depending on the context, that can take different forms. It can mean bringing a small sort of gift of appreciation to make people feel that you're valuing their time. It can mean using enumerators who are sort of local, speak the right language, know how to make the right kind of chit chat and small talk to make people feel comfortable. It can mean opening the survey with questions that are more interesting to the respondent, even if it's not quite the topics you actually want to get to. So like, I never open a survey with the hard hitting, like, tell me your revenue from last year, right? We open the survey with, tell me about the challenges you're facing with the pandemic last year. How was that for your business? Right. And everybody wants to talk about the challenges they're facing and how things are going for them. Right. And as you start with something that makes people feel like they'd like to engage with you. And if you have good, well-trained enumerators, they then build on that to have kind of the survey is enjoyable. They have a trusting relationship that makes people more likely to respond. There's also kind of the brute force, which is at the end, you end up with people who didn't respond, and you can throw a lot of effort into tracking those individuals. Right? You can sort of step up the hard to find people or the hard to persuade people. You can send in your field manager who's maybe better at persuasion than the enumerators are, right? And just kind of focus a lot of effort to try to get those last few people. And a kind of final step that I think I think I learned this from David McKenzie. I'm not sure if he originated the idea, but you can take a sample of non-respondents and go really crazy, throw big incentives or big tracking efforts at them. And then you can reweight those individuals in the final analysis to sort of assume that those people are representative of all the people who were hard to track without having to actually pay the costs of following up with literally everyone in the hard to track group. So those are 3 ideas I can give you, but that's a really hard problem.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much.
You may have just answered Stephen's question, but Stephen, if you feel like your question isn't answered, do you want to ask it or ask another one? Go for it.
Okay, thank you. Thanks very much for the lecture. It's full of practical hints and tips. I really appreciate that. But so, I mean, you've kind of alluded to it, and I liked your description of people suddenly finding that asking a 300-page questionnaire was a bit too much for the respondents. And with the Lagos project in mind, I mean, just specifically on that, how did you incentivize participation and accuracy and honesty, really, because it's obviously such a large, detailed, and personal project. How and if you incentivize, how did you avoid creating bias?
Yeah, that's another tough question. So I think the number one thing was just keeping the survey much shorter than I thought I had to. And honestly, every year it's now a panel survey. We go back every year. My enumerators convince me that we need to make the survey even shorter. I think it's not a good idea to give incentives that are so large that people are really responding because of the incentive, as opposed to sort of a token to make people feel appreciated and feel like you have skin in the game. I think that can induce kind of bias in who responds if it's a big enough incentive that's really why people are talking to you. I guess I would say there are often ways of asking questions that make it easier for people to not lie to you. So for instance, to take a specific example from the Lagos survey, I don't ask people what tariffs they pay when they import goods, because absolutely most people are not paying, stated tariffs. I ask one question that's basically, how much did you pay to clear the port? And I know that the response to that includes, whatever tariffs or fees they're actually paying that may or may not be the posted fees. It involves bribes. It involves like the fixers they hired to actually get their goods through. And I just sort of adjust the analysis I want to do to like allow me to use that vaguer question. Another thing I found was really sensitive is people don't want to tell me who their suppliers are, because that's valuable private information. But I really wanted supplier identifiers so that I could use this panel strategy. And so I tell people that they can give me a nickname for a supplier. So it's something they'll recognize so that I can link across transactions within an individual from that same supplier, but it's nothing I could use to actually like go cut them out of the chain and buy from their supplier. So I guess, that's a very idiosyncratic answer to a generally tough question, but I guess I think you have to be a bit creative to get around the things that are particularly sensitive in a particular context. And the last thing I'll throw out there is I think actually often it's less of a problem for primary data collection than for any other data source, even if it's still a problem, right? Who do they have more incentive to lie to, me or the Nigerian government? So it may be imperfect, but it may still be kind of better than what else, the other options we have.
So out of interest, did you offer an incentive? And can I ask you what it was?
For the Lego survey, we offer basically a very small airtime card. So it's usually about a dollar to $1.50 worth of basically phone airtime credit, which for these traders it's nice, but these are much bigger businesses. Then yeah, that's not a big deal for them.
I'm sort of amazed that you got 30 grand in the bank. You're bringing it to China. You buy a bunch of stuff. You fly in an airplane. $2 on credit. I mean, it's like it's a rounding error for these guys.
And sometimes they say, I don't care, give it to someone else. Surprisingly frequently, they'll say, oh, send it to my daughter. Like, let me give you another phone number, send the credit to my daughter. And sometimes I'm sure they don't care, but I think it's kind of it's a gesture that we're not scammers, right? It's just, we have skin in the game. We're serious people. We're kind of coming to them in a respectful way that says, we acknowledge that you're giving us time. I think is kind of, to the extent that it helps, that those are the reasons that it helps.
It's a symbolic gesture more than anything else.
Yeah.
Okay, so that there was actually multiple questions about that. Some people have had similar questions. If they have others, they can ask again, but there was a bunch on that. So Joachim, you've waited patiently. Do you want to ask your question?
Thank you so much for well-detailed presentation, Prof. What I wanted to check from you, were your questions linked to your research questions or research objectives? That is number one. Number two, it's on the study population sampling frame. From your presentation, it was saying that the sample was comprised of 1,200 respondents. Where did the 1,200 respondents came from? What was the study population?
Yeah, so on the first question,
Can I suggest, Meredith, that you answer that briefly, because it's not
absolutely. Yeah, so I think, so briefly on the first question, I think it can be really useful to say, what are my hypotheses that I'm trying to test in my research, and ask a variety of questions that correspond to different outcomes you would expect to see if some hypothesis was correct. So, in my case, there were a bunch of reasons I thought traders might be traveling. And so I asked questions like, did you find new products? Did you bargain with suppliers? What price did you pay? That corresponded to different hypotheses that I had. On the second one, the sample came from this big listing. So I basically had a list that said, there are 12 shops selling furniture on the 3rd floor of this building. Okay, and the population that I was representing was traders in shops in those commercial areas, and I sampled from that listing.
Okay, thank you so much. Thank you. Now clear.
You're welcome.
So I want to ask two questions that kind of were a mix of things that were asked and things that I was thinking about during your lecture. One was, you said sample from the census. And so do you want to just say a little bit about how a junior person might kind of do that? And how does that work?
Sorry, you mean like once you have a census in a particular context, or like suppose you don't, what do you do about that?
Imagine I want to pull, let me take a variant of Joachim's question. I want to pull 1,200 people from the census and ask them questions. So now I know it's a nationally representative set, or maybe a representative set of people from Lagos or some city.
Mm-hmm.
Is it that census bureaus, when you knock on their door or send them an email, they say, oh, here's 1,200 people? It doesn't sound like they're going to email you the list of 1,200 people in the country if you contact them. Just saying mechanically, want to do represent. It's also related to Pamela's question, although I think in her case, just going to the market, right, people buying milk is the right strategy.
Right. So very rarely. And I should clarify, when I say census in my context, I don't mean in a like administrative government sense. I mean, like, my team conducted the census of shops, right? So if you do it yourself, then yes, you can just sample 1,200 shops from your list because you have the full list. If you don't, I think sometimes, like if you're running an RCT and you get lucky, you have a partner that actually has, a big list of households or firms with contact information, and they will let you just run some code to sample from that. That's an ideal situation. I think more commonly you can't. And another situation that you can run into is that like you have a list from somewhere, but it doesn't actually have all the information you need to track those individuals. So like I've run into those situations where like, sure, there's an address, but if you actually try to follow up with that address, it's hard to find people. I don't think I have a one size fits all suggestion about that. I think it's kind of very idiosyncratic depending on what information you have.
Yeah, okay, no, that's helpful. I guess there in one context that for something that I had done, we had the Census Bureau in Ghana give us a representative sample of areas. You know, we just said, so it's not individual data, but we said, we want to do a representative sample. We can't go to every part of the country. Could you give us 20 urban areas and 20, rural areas? And they kind of like emailed us that. And then we could say, at least from that. And so they didn't charge us for that. And I wouldn't say they were particularly eager to do it, but like without any money. So I guess it's something a junior person could do on their own if they wanted kind of representative of some area or some sector. Then it's not individual.
That's right. And let me add an idea that you can also do if you have a limited budget and you don't have a listing, which is if you can define geographic areas that you want to represent, either like you're saying, David, like somebody gives you like villages that are representative in some way, or if you just, like the city you're interested in or something. Another strategy I've used that saves time and money is basically superimpose a grid over the map of the areas that you're interested in, and then sample cells from that grid. So you're like basically sampling a physical area on the map, and then you send your enumerators just to that area, that cell, and you do a full census of whoever the unit of interest is within that little cell. And it can be bigger or smaller depending on the time and money you have. Right. And that's another way of kind of pulling a representative sample from a geographic area without actually having to do a full census of the entire city or whatever. And I believe that's actually at least related to the sampling strategy that the World Bank enterprise surveys use for their micro informal surveys.
Okay, no, that's helpful. Let me, if I may, ask one more that I think may be useful for people. So we're kind of, we're in the AI age, whether we like it or not. And, so how can AI help with survey design? Ben Marks told me about a software he was using where you would upload your survey instrument. And for each question, it would give you an AI generated kind of score based on the cognitive load that you're putting on the interviewer. For example, imagine the question is, did you work for pay or profit in the last week? Low, yes, no, it's not a hard question. You could be sound asleep and answer it. Imagine you say, suppose you were to take another trip to China, and suppose that the risk of having a visa issue that would stop you at the border were 25% greater than the current risk. How much would you say that you would buy in that? Once you start adding in stuff like that, the AI would kind of, I don't know how it does it. You can use your imagination. It tells you this is going to be a high cognitive load. Are you aware of things? It seems like we should all be kind of doing that because we all think that everybody understands exactly what we're saying. And in reality, nobody's listening. They want to go back to their life. So I'm not familiar with AI tools to do that. I would say I totally agree that the process, like that thought process of how does somebody in a particular setting actually understand the question I'm asking rather than how did I intend it is exactly the process you want to go through. It's very cool if there are new tools to help with that. My guess about what the AI would be doing is for a long time, there have been tools online that sort of like evaluate the reading level of a sentence or paragraph, right? Like, does this correspond to standards for like a 9th grade reading level in the US? And that's about like the vocabulary and how complex the sentence structure and the grammar is and so on. So my hunch would be that it's doing something like that. I think that's really cool. My note of caution would be that I suspect for development economists, there's a lot of sort of context-specific issues that are relevant to doing that evaluation, right? Language spoken, sort of local dialect and vocabulary, concepts that are kind of inherently comprehensible to people in a particular cultural or business setting and ones that aren't. And my guess is that the AI is not doing a very good job of being well tailored to the settings we work in.
But I would say that thought process of like, does the person understand this word? Do they understand hypotheticals? Have I made this sentence so long and run on that nobody can possibly remember what I said at the beginning of it anymore, right? Like those are great things to be evaluating, whether you use the AI or not.
If people need to go, they can go, but this is, we're all going to kind of be doing this sooner or later. So I hate to kind of cut things off here. Emmanuel,
I'm happy to hang out if there are more questions.
So Emmanuel, you've been saying a lot of things in the chat. You don't have to talk if you don't want to, but do you have a related question? You can go ahead and ask it. If not, no big deal. I saw your hand go up, and then we've been chatting about this. Okay, so
Emmanuel, but he's muted.
He's he may not be in a position. Sometimes I kind of promote people and they're just not in a position that they don't have the bandwidth to talk. They'd rather type. So Emmanuel, why don't we hold off then for a second? That Joachim, your hand went up again. Do you have another comment, or is that an accident?
No, I really enjoyed the presentation because it was quite thorough, and in the approaches and in the also like advantages and disadvantages and things also to be careful on when you are designing the data gathering tools, and especially the piloting. I was also much interested to see how the pilot of such a magnitude can be done. Like what kind of sample size you can say this one is okay for me to say I've done a proper pilot.
Yeah. Again, it depends on your context, but I would say I often do pilots that are a few dozen interviews, or kind of maybe the equivalent of about a week's worth of work, but I would often do it in several stages. So like we would go out for 1 or 2 days and do one version of the questionnaire, and then we would go out for another day with some revisions or a different strategy and try those. So, I would maybe consider doing like 30 interviews, but it wouldn't just be go out and do 30 interviews all at once and then come back and look at the data. It would be in stages.
Okay, thank you so much.
Okay, Joe, do you want to
jump in on that?
Yeah, go for it.
I was just going to say, I think it depends on what you're trying to accomplish a lot with the pilot. If you're just trying to test out the survey instrument or something, smaller numbers, and this kind of daily updating is the right way to go. If you're trying to pilot something because answering the real question is going to take a ton of money, and you're using it as a proof of concept that this will work or something like that, or to get power, to refine power tests for a larger study, you may need a bigger sample. So I think a lot of it has to do with what you have in mind.
That's a great point. And I think the second thing Joe's saying is especially relevant if it's your pilot for like an RCT or an intervention you're going to run. Then you need to think about sort of getting enough observations that you have power to evaluate whether it's worth going ahead with the intervention, or convince a funder to fund the intervention or something. So that might be a much larger type of pilot than what I'm talking about, which is just kind of testing the data collection. Yeah, totally agree.
Okay, so I think we're way over time, so we should stop here. Meredith, thanks again for the really stimulating lecture, and thanks everybody for the Q&A. The slides are posted. Some people said they couldn't quite access them, but if you just Google CEPR STEG, you'll find it fast enough. So Mandy, do you want to flash again the remaining 2 lectures? We've only got 2 lectures left in the class, so Cheryl's going to talk next Friday about gender data, and Charles time use the week after that, and then we're finished. I can't believe the course is coming to an end already. Thanks again, Meredith. That was really excellent. Everybody else, thanks again, and we'll see you next week.
Meredith, not sure if you're there, but that was great. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks to you guys for organizing this course. I really, as I said at the beginning, I feel like there are too few opportunities to really talk about data in detail. So this is awesome.
And by the way, I didn't disagree with your take at all in terms of the questions. I think like whatever you're measuring, you want to certainly do that and be creative, you know, if you're introducing a study because something hasn't been measured to it. But I still think no matter what, even in that case, you still want to link it somehow to what's been done before.